"No one wants a fat girl, sir, but I can nurse the baby," said the cook. The widower said, "Then stay." Carter's Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Late autumn, 1889. The stagecoach rolled off in a swirl of dust, leaving behind a woman standing awkwardly on the cracked wooden porch of the ranch house. The land stretched wide and golden around her, fields brittle from the cold, a wind slicing through the hills like a whispered warning. Margaret Doyle, known to most as Maggie, stood with her satchel clutched tightly in both hands. Her frame was broad, sturdy, what many would call built for the kitchen, and others, less kindly, would not bother to sugarcoat. Her cheeks were red from wind and nerves, her eyes steady. She wore a plain brown dress, with an apron folded neatly on top and a handkerchief tied over her hair. This wasn't her first kitchen, but it was the first where she didn't come just to cook, but maybe, just maybe, to matter. The front door was ajar. No one had come out to greet her. Maggie looked around. Chickens clucked somewhere near the back of the house. A horse huffed softly from the barn. And inside, behind that cracked door, an infant was crying, loud, sharp, endless. She stepped in without knocking. The kitchen was sparse and cool, the fire in the stove barely alive. Dishes were piled. A bottle lay tipped near a feeding cloth. The crying grew louder. She followed it. At the end of the hallway, in a room with one window and no curtains, the child wailed from a crib that had seen better days. Maggie's heart pulled, low and old like a muscle remembering a song. She stepped in. "There, now, shh," she whispered. The baby, perhaps 4 months old, was red-faced and damp with sweat. Maggie bent slowly, lifting him in her arms with practiced ease. He was warm, too warm. She cradled him carefully, rocking back and forth, then began to hum, a lullaby, not English, old Gaelic, passed from her grandmother's tongue to her own. "Hush now, my heart, the wind's at the door, but the fire is warm, and I'll keep you sure. I for." The baby's cries faltered, then hiccuped into silence, a creak behind her. She turned her head, not startled, just knowing. A man stood at the doorway, tall, lean, shoulders square with effort, not pride. James Bellamy, the ranch's owner. 32, though grief aged him. A month's worth of stubble shadowed his face. His eyes were pale, unreadable. "You're the new cook?" His voice was low, wary. Maggie nodded, adjusting the child on her shoulder. "Margaret Doyle. Most call me Maggie." He didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the baby, now asleep against her chest. Then they moved, hesitant, to her. Maggie straightened. She didn't step back, didn't explain. She had learned not to fill silence just to soften judgment. When he said nothing, she spoke first, softly, simply, and without flinching. "No one wants a fat girl, sir, but I can nurse the baby." It wasn't pity in her voice. It was truth. James looked at her a long moment. He didn't smile. But something shifted behind his eyes, something tired, something surrendering. "Then stay." Just that. He turned and walked away. Maggie didn't exhale until he was gone. She looked down at the boy, now breathing easy against her chest. She hadn't planned to stay long. She never did. Kitchens weren't built for women like her to be seen, just used, then replaced. But maybe here, maybe this once, she wouldn't be asked to disappear. The dawn broke pale over Carter's Hollow, light filtering through the kitchen window in soft, dusty bands. Maggie stood at the hearth, sleeves rolled, apron secured, stirring oats in a heavy iron pot. Outside the wind whispered through the hollows, but inside the house the world waited, waiting for child's cry, waiting for a voice. By the time the baby woke, she was ready. She washed his face, changed his linen shirt, warmed milk. She hummed the old Irish lullaby once more, gentle and unhurried, letting the words soften the air as much as the cloth softening his cheeks. Afterwards, she crossed to the pantry and pulled fresh eggs from their nest box. She cracked them into a skillet, added a swirl of cream, herbs picked the day before. The fragrance rose. Butter, eggs, thyme. It filled the cabin. In the dining room, a table was set with the smell of breakfast, but only one place waited. Maggie did not join the seat across from James's. She never sat at the same table with him. She slipped plates quietly to the staff, took her own meal in the nook by the window, turned her back to the fields she'd yet to know. James stepped in after the meal, his boots creaking on the floor planks. He left a slip of paper on the kitchen counter. "Feed baby at 11, check fence corner behind barn, we lost 3 calves." He left before she could respond. This became the pattern. Maggie cooked with care. She washed, she swept, she laid warm blankets, and each time she found a note rather than a greeting, a job rather than a question. She accepted them. She did not ask why she was never invited to dinner or to sit near the fire in the evening. Out on the range, the ranch hands talked. "Bellamy hired a nursemaid, I heard. My word, she's built like a beast. She fat enough to hide the feed sacks under her dress. And the master, what? He wants a cook or a mama. You see how he looks at her." Laughter followed their boots to the corral. Maggie heard those murmurs. When someone paused to look, she met their eyes only for a second, then carried on. She had learned long ago that silence was better than anger. She didn't wear shame, she wore duty. One afternoon, the baby lay on the floor by his high chair, gurgling over a block of wood. Maggie had finished baking. A fresh loaf of raisin bread emerged from the oven. She wrapped a small piece in linen and walked to James's room. There she leaned the bread at his door, on the threshold. A note beside it, in her neat hand. "It's blueberry." The baby liked the smell. She turned and left without knocking. That evening, James returned later than usual. The dinner table was laid out, candles lit, but his chair stood empty. Maggie served it anyway. She did not watch him arrive or wait for approval. She served quietly, then retired to her corner once the plates were cleared. By morning, the bread was gone, the linen cloth unfolded, the few crumbs gone from the plate around the bread. No response, no word, but the absence of comment spoke something louder than thanks. Maggie continued her routine. Morning chores, baby's cries, baking, waiting. But a subtle shift took root. She no longer recoiled when her sleeves brushed the table. She no longer hesitated at the cupboard near James's door. She moved with a small certainty. Outside, the hands noticed. "She's baking again, bread smell," one said. "He seems to be eating it," another answered. They glanced her direction. For once, her back was turned, and yet the glance held respect. At dusk, she stood on the porch as the sun slid beneath the hills, the scent of bread still in the air. The baby cooed in his crib behind her. James came up the steps quietly, no announcement. He didn't sit next to her. He didn't speak. He simply tipped his hat and walked inside. She watched his boots disappear. And the bread bowl sat half empty on the table, her gift accepted in silence, but accepted nonetheless. Rain had fallen every day that week, turning the paths around the Carter's Hollow ranch into a mess of thick, clinging mud. The skies remained low and gray, the kind that pressed down on your bones and whispered, "Stay inside." But Maggie had a coop to check and a baby in her arms. She stepped out the back door, one hand holding the boy close to her chest, the other clutching the edge of her skirt. Her feet sank into the muck, bare and quiet, as she moved carefully around the chicken yard. The mud sucked at her soles, cold and unforgiving. Her hair had slipped from its tie, strands clinging to her cheeks. The hem of her dress was soaked dark. Yet her face showed nothing but focus, eyes fixed on the hens, on the child, on the little rhythm of care that no one else noticed. James came around the side of the barn, a wooden bucket in hand. He was halfway through feeding the horses when he spotted her. He stopped short. For a moment, he didn't recognize what he saw, not because she looked different, but because the image struck something in him, something wordless and still. A round woman, worn dress, clinging in the rain, hair undone, her feet thick with earth. Not beautiful in the way portraits claimed, not delicate, but rooted, fiercely alive. He leaned against the fence rail, letting the bucket rest against his hip. "Did you lose your shoes?" he asked quietly. Maggie turned her head, her cheeks flushed red at being seen like that. "No," she said softly, eyes dropping to her feet. Just, the other one's too small now. I grew. It didn't. James didn't laugh. He didn't speak again. He just nodded once, slowly, and walked back toward the house. His boots left deep tracks behind him. That night, Maggie sat by the fire with a worn cloth in her hands, drying the old shoe she still owned. It was cracked near the heel, the stitching unraveling along the edge. She turned it over gently, like something precious. She remembered when someone had once sneered, "Fat girls don't need fine shoes," and how she'd hidden them in the back of her drawer ever since. The shoes had never fit, but she'd never thrown them away. The next morning, when she stepped onto the porch to gather water, Maggie stopped short. There, resting on the wooden planks, was a pair of leather boots, small but sturdy, well worn but polished, clean, laces tied, soles freshly oiled, and tucked into one of them, a folded note. She picked it up with trembling fingers. "These were my sister's. She never came back to get them. I think they'd rather stay here." The handwriting was awkward, slanted, almost childlike, but it was unmistakably his. Maggie didn't cry. She didn't smile, either. She simply placed a hand over her chest, holding in the strange, full feeling blooming inside her. Then she bent down and touched the boots, running her fingers along the seams like she was tracing a line back to something she'd lost. She didn't thank him. She didn't look for him. But the next day, she wore them. She stepped through the wet yard in those boots like she had always belonged in them, shoulders square, head high. The child rode on her hip, and her steps were lighter somehow, even in the mud. From the hill beyond the pasture, James stood beside a split fence post, hammer in hand. He didn't wave, he didn't call, but he watched her walk. And in the quiet grip of morning fog, his eyes softened, just a little, like something heavy had shifted in him, like he'd seen her, truly, for the very first time. The wind changed that evening, sharper, colder than the days before. A storm had passed, leaving the ranch wet and silent, but now the air held the kind of chill that sank straight through the walls. The baby was restless all day. By nightfall his cheeks were red, his skin clammy, and his cries came in jagged gasps. Maggie paced the kitchen, slicing ginger into thin strips and tossing them into boiling water. She moved fast but calm, the way women do when they've done this before. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair tied up, her eyes set in concentration. Then the door swung open hard. James stepped in, face drawn tight, hair tousled, his shirt damp from sweat and anxiety. He held the baby awkwardly in his arms, the child's cries echoing off the walls. "He won't stop," James muttered, voice ragged. "He's burning up." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. "I know what to do," she said gently. "It's an old remedy. Ginger water and cool cloth. I've used it before. It helps." She reached for the child instinctively, but James stepped back. His jaw clenched, his eyes were wild with exhaustion. "I didn't hire you to be his mother." The words came sharp, louder than he meant them to be. But the silence that followed made them ring louder still. Maggie froze. She didn't flinch, didn't argue. She simply stood still, one hand still outstretched, the other holding the damp cloth she'd prepared. Her eyes met his, not angry, not pleading. Just tired, just hurt. Her voice was quiet, low enough that it made James lean in slightly to hear. "I never asked to be anyone's wife, Mr. Bellamy." Then she turned, folded the cloth neatly, and placed it on the table. Without another word, she walked out of the kitchen, her steps heavy but unhurried. James stood in the middle of the room, the baby still crying in his arms. He looked down at the cloth. Still warm. Looked toward the doorway where Maggie had vanished, and suddenly, all the anger he thought he'd felt dissolved into something far worse, shame. He'd lashed out not because he didn't need her, but because he did, too much, too soon, and that frightened him more than he could say. Later that night, the house was still. James had managed to quiet the baby with slow rocking and a lullaby he didn't know he remembered. But the fever held on. The boy whimpered, tossing and turning in his cradle. James sat beside the crib, half asleep in the chair, one hand resting on the edge of the blanket. Then he heard it. Soft footsteps in the hall, the creak of the kitchen door. He didn't move, just listened. The stove clinked, water poured. Herbs rustled. Minutes later, something settled by the door. James rose and opened it quietly. There, on the floor, was a small wooden basin filled with steaming water and herbs. A folded towel rested beside it, carefully soaked and wrung out. No note, no knock. He looked down the hallway. Maggie's door was closed, her lamp snuffed. He crouched, picked up the towel, and returned to the baby. He dabbed the child's forehead slowly, just as he'd seen her do. The crying faded into soft breaths. James stared at the sleeping boy, then at the window, where a sliver of moonlight fell across the floor. "She doesn't want to be your mother, son," he whispered. "But she's better than I ever deserved." He didn't sleep that night, but the fever broke just before dawn. The morning sun filtered through the parlor window, casting narrow beams across the dust that hung in the air. Maggie was on her knees by the bookshelf, wiping each wooden shelf with a damp rag. She liked the quiet moments, liked the smell of old pages, the feel of worn spines under her fingers. She reached for a stack of newspapers near the bottom and accidentally brushed a small wooden box tucked behind them. It tumbled with a dull thud. The lid popped open. Maggie froze. Inside lay a black and white photograph, its corners worn, edges curled. A woman looked out from the faded image, slight and narrow-shouldered, her expression distant and fragile. Her eyes were sad, her smile tentative, like it had never really finished forming. There were letters, too, paper yellowed with age, creased and soft, their ink faded but still readable in the morning light. Maggie's heart sank. She reached forward, hands trembling, and gently tried to close the lid. But before she could, James's shadow fell across the doorway. He had seen. Their eyes met, for a moment, silence, but he didn't scold her, didn't snatch the box or raise his voice. He walked in slowly, kneeling beside her. His hands rested on his knees. His voice, when it came, was so soft it barely stirred the air. "She wasn't like you," he said. Maggie lowered her gaze. James picked up the photograph and looked at it for a long time. "She was beautiful in that way men call beautiful," he continued. "Delicate, small. I loved her the second I saw her, and I think that's where I failed her." He reached into the box and pulled out the most crumpled letter, the one with the bent corner and a faint water stain. He unfolded it with care, smoothing it on his thigh. "She wrote this a month before she died," he said. "Then read aloud, one line, his voice flat. I want to be loved for staying alive, not for vanishing slowly." He didn't look at Maggie. She stopped eating, bit by bit. She thought if she stayed small, I'd love her more. I never told her otherwise, never told her she didn't need to earn anything. His thumb traced the edge of the letter. "I didn't hurt her with fists. I hurt her with silence. Every skipped meal, I said nothing. Every new hollow in her cheek, I smiled like it was grace. I watched her disappear right in front of me, and I let her think she had to." His voice didn't shake, but the stillness around him seemed to shift, like even the house itself held its breath. Maggie didn't speak. She didn't try to soothe him, didn't say you didn't know or you did your best. Those words had no place here. Instead, she reached forward and laid her hand on his. It was warm, wide, calloused, solid, alive. James blinked, as if startled by the touch. Then he turned his hand over and closed it around hers. His grip was rough, uncertain, like a man clutching a ledge after hanging too long. And then, from somewhere deep in his chest, came a sound, not quite a sob, a laugh, cracked and bitter, but real. "You're the first person to touch me," he said, voice low, "without asking permission first." Maggie didn't let go. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, there was no past, no ghosts, no echoes of small wastes and skipped meals. Only a man and a woman, both scarred, both human, both still choosing to stay. The light was golden that afternoon, soft and full like a memory that refused to fade. Autumn had arrived in Carter's Hollow, and the hills beyond the pasture were streaked in amber and rust. The ranch, too, had taken on the hush of a season turning inward, quieter, gentler somehow. The wind no longer whispered promises of growth, but carried instead a lullaby of letting go. Leaves scattered across the porch, chickens clucked lazily in the fading sun. The world slowed to a softer rhythm. In the kitchen, Maggie stood at the worn wooden counter, her hands deep in dough. She kneaded with focus, her arms dusted in flour, cheeks flushed from the warmth of the oven. A stray wisp of hair had come loose, sticking to her temple, and the comb in her hair tilted precariously. She hummed quietly under her breath, not a song exactly, more a sound of someone at peace with her task. The door creaked open, and James stepped inside. His boots thudded softly on the floorboards. He carried something in his arms, carefully folded, almost reverently, like it might fall apart if handled too roughly. His face was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw, a nervousness in his step. "I found something in the attic," he said, voice low. Maggie looked up, brushing her hands down the front of her apron. Her brow furrowed as she moved toward the table. He laid the bundle down, then slowly unfolded it. A dress, cream-colored, the kind of cream that time had kissed gently, fading it without stealing its soul. The fabric was soft, worn but fine. It had simple lines and a modest cut. A small scalloped lace collar, hand-stitched details along the hem, some of them fraying now. Maggie blinked, unsure. "It was hers," James said quietly, "but she never wore it, said she was waiting to be thin enough." He ran his finger down one sleeve, gaze distant. "I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it, but it's not hers anymore." Maggie's breath caught, her lips parted as if to protest, but the words didn't come. "James, I couldn't possibly," she whispered. He looked at her, really looked. Not through her, not around her, but into her. "I mended it," he said. "My stitches aren't perfect. You'll see the seams." She let out a small sound, part disbelief, part wonder. "And I thought, maybe that's the point." He stepped closer, not hurriedly, not forcefully, just close enough. "Because you're the only one who's never asked to be smaller. The only one who carries her scars like proof of living, not shame." He paused, then added, almost a whisper, "You're the only one that dress was waiting for." Maggie's throat tightened. She pressed her fingers to her lips, eyes wet. The tears didn't fall dramatically. They came like spring rain, gentle, unannounced, healing. She didn't speak. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the fabric, then pulled it to her chest and held it there, like it had always belonged to her. Later, at the harvest festival, the townspeople gathered under strings of lanterns and colored bunting. Music floated through the cool air. Children darted between hay bales. The scent of apples and cinnamon lingered everywhere. And there she was, Maggie, wearing the cream-colored dress, visibly mended, lovingly worn. It didn't fit like a dress made for show. It fit like a dress made for truth. Her truth. A woman who didn't shrink for anyone. She carried James's son on her hip. The child reached for her face, giggling, his fingers tugging at the lace on her collar. Maggie laughed, full-throated, without apology. People turned to look, not out of judgment, but reverence. James stood beside the cider barrel, hands in his pockets, watching. His gaze never left her. A man nearby asked, "Is that the dress your wife never wore?" James nodded once. "She wears it now." The first frost came early that year. It coated the barn roof in silver, dusted the pumpkins in the field with a quiet sheen. The morning air bit through wool shawls and made the horse's breath steam in thick clouds. The world felt like it was holding its breath, suspended in that hush that only comes when the land begins to sleep. Maggie stood by the fence at the edge of the field, her carpetbag at her feet. The cream-colored dress had been folded and left behind on the bed, smoothed out with careful hands, as if she didn't want to crease the memory it carried. Today, she wore her old coat, the one patched at the elbows and missing a button near the collar. It barely kept the cold out, but it was familiar, and that mattered more this morning. James had known something was wrong the moment he woke, and the baby's cradle was empty. Maggie had fed him, bundled him in the soft quilt she stitched herself, and left the child asleep in a basket by the hearth, warm and safe. He found her just as she was tightening the leather strap on her bag. She didn't startle when he approached. She must have heard his boots crunch the gravel long before he reached her. She turned to him slowly, eyes red but dry, her expression calm. "I've cooked, cleaned, mended. I helped when your son was sick. I wore the dress," she said, voice quiet but steady. "But you don't owe me anything, Mr. Bellamy." Her use of his full name stung more than he expected. It was distance, made formal. She continued, each word landing like a quiet farewell. "I stayed because it felt right, not because it was promised. But now it feels finished. I did my part." James stood there, silent, a foot away but feeling like a mile. He looked at her, really looked, and saw something he hadn't let himself see before: the weariness beneath her strength, the heartbreak behind her composure. She was ready to leave, not because she wanted to, but because she believed she should. "Is that what this was?" he asked finally, voice low and rough. "A part? A role?" Maggie didn't flinch. It was kindness, and survival, for both of us. She bent to pick up her bag, but James moved without thinking. His hand caught her wrist, not to hold her back, just to pause her, to make her look again. She did. Their eyes met, and time slowed for a breath. He didn't say her name, didn't plead. He just asked, like a man risking the only thing left to lose, "If I proposed right now, would you think it's out of pity?" Maggie's breath caught. She searched his face, mapped every sorrow, every regret. There was no charm in his features, nothing polished. But there was something better, something real. "No," she whispered, "but if you don't," her voice trembled, "if you don't, I'll think it's because you're afraid I mean it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then James closed his eyes briefly, like he was listening to something inside him that had been quiet for too long. When he opened them, he let go of her wrist and took her hand instead. It was rough, cold and calloused, but he held hers like it was the only thing that had ever felt right in his hands. They didn't kiss, no grand gesture, no perfect words. Just the sound of frost crunching underfoot, the whisper of cornstalks swaying behind them, and the weight of a truth finally spoken aloud. James looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. "You're the only woman I've ever wanted to walk home with." That was all. Maggie nodded once, and this time, when the tears fell, they were quiet, easy, unashamed. Together, they stood in the pale morning frost, not making promises, just standing in something real, something earned, truth. And that, at last, was enough. The morning sun had just begun to stretch through the windows when Maggie stepped into the kitchen. The air smelled of coffee and dew. She tightened the belt of her robe and rubbed sleep from her eyes as the floor creaked beneath her bare feet. The fire in the hearth crackled low, and there, on the table, next to her usual cup of coffee, sat something small and shining. A ring. Simple. No stone. Just a smooth band of gold that caught the morning light like it had waited all night just to glow. Maggie stood still. Her hand hovered near the cup. The steam from the coffee rose in little swirls between her fingers and the ring. James was nowhere in sight. She turned her head, eyes scanning the kitchen. Then she heard it, a soft laugh from the front room. "The babies." She smiled. And then she laughed, soft, full, disbelieving. She picked up the ring, turned it in her hand, then placed it carefully back where she found it, sat down, sipped her coffee. When James walked in, the baby on his hip, she didn't look up at first. He stood awkwardly, shifting the boy from one arm to the other. "You didn't say anything," he muttered. "I did," Maggie replied, still sipping. "You just weren't in the room." James raised an eyebrow. And? She pushed the ring back toward him.